"The trip's already paid for, dear, but you get better," my husband said, packing his suitcase. They flew off as a family, and I called the notary right from my hospital bed. When they returned, tanned and happy, a surprise was waiting for them. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains of the spacious kitchen where Margaret Williams prepared breakfast for her family. With precise movements, she sliced cheese, occasionally glancing at her tablet with open stock market reports. Gray barely touched her chestnut hair, pulled back in a neat bun. At 52, she looked fit and energetic. Years working in finance had taught her to value discipline. The sound of running water came from the bathroom. Her husband Andrew had finally woken up. Margaret sighed, setting a third coffee cup on the table. Their daughter Karina sat at the table already, absorbed in her phone. "Mom, do you have $800 until payday? The travel agency is delaying commissions, and I need to pay for my gym membership," she said, without looking up from the screen. Margaret nodded, habitually opening her banking app. Money requests had become so routine they no longer prompted questions or discussion. "Transferred," she answered briefly, sending the amount and returning to making scrambled eggs. Andrew appeared in the doorway in a worn bathrobe, with damp hair and the usual bags under his eyes. 28 years of married life had transformed him from a promising historian into a tired community college instructor who had accepted his role as second fiddle in the family. "Good morning," he mumbled, heading to his seat at the table. "Margaret, don't forget there's a parent-teacher conference on Thursday for my niece. I need to cover for my sister." "I won't be able to pick you up," Margaret replied, setting out plates. "I have a client meeting at 6. Again. Andrew sighed, but quickly wilted under her firm gaze. "Fine, I'll take the bus." Karina looked up from her phone. "By the way, Mom, you haven't changed your mind about helping me with the down payment on a new car? Mine's falling apart." "Karina, we discussed this. I just paid for your trip to Cancun a month ago." Margaret spoke calmly, but steel notes rang in her voice. "But Mom, you know I need to look good at the agency, and the car is part of my image. How can I drive clients around in my piece of junk?" Margaret silently looked at her daughter. Karina reminded her very much of herself in her youth, the same determination, only directed not at a career, but at living for pleasure. After graduating from the tourism program, she'd gotten a job as a manager at a prestigious agency, but preferred talking about work to actually working. "I'll think about it," Margaret finally said, though she knew perfectly well she'd agree in the end. She always agreed. The front door slammed, and Nicholas, her younger son, burst into the kitchen, the eternal student and seeker of purpose. At 25, he'd already changed jobs 3 times after finishing law school, and now worked as a paralegal at a small firm, dreaming of a real case. "Hi, everyone," he exclaimed cheerfully, kissing his mother on the cheek. "Mom, you're the best. Thanks for the transfer. I already picked up my documents from the old firm, starting at the new place tomorrow." "Again, Nicholas?" Margaret asked wearily. "We agreed you'd stick it out for at least 6 months in one place." "Mom, there were 0 prospects there. But this is real legal practice potential partnership in the future." Nicholas spoke quickly and enthusiastically, as always when defending his impulsive decisions. Margaret shook her head and looked at her watch. "I have to go. I'll be late tonight, meeting with management." She quickly finished her coffee, gathered documents in her leather briefcase, and, adjusting her strict suit, headed for the door. "Andrew, don't forget to start the washing machine and take the meat out of the freezer. Karina, water the plants. Nicholas, take out the trash." The usual morning instructions, the usual nods in response. Margaret knew half wouldn't get done, and in the evening she'd do everything necessary herself. The whole day at the oil company office, where Margaret worked as a senior financial analyst, passed in meetings and calls. After lunch, the principal called about her nephew's behavioral problems at school. Margaret promised to talk to her sister. Then she had to sort out an issue with Nicholas's loan. The bank had sent an overdue payment notice. In the evening, returning home on a packed subway, Margaret scrolled through resort photos on her phone. The idea had begun forming a week ago when she'd accidentally seen an ad for the Maldives' Azure Ocean, snow-white beaches, overwater villas. The last time they'd vacationed as a family was 3 years ago. And that was just in Florida because Andrew was afraid of flying. I should give them a gift, Margaret thought, examining photos of the luxury resort. Nicholas will stabilize, Karina will mature, and Andrew and I, maybe there we'll remember that we once loved each other. No one was home. A note from Andrew on the table. Went to reunion, back late. The meat still lay in the freezer. The plants stood dry. No one had taken out the trash. Margaret mechanically completed all the household chores, ate reheated soup, and sat down at her laptop. Until midnight, she compiled a financial plan for the next 6 months. If she tightened her belt, took on additional projects, and gave up the planned bathroom renovation, by May they could afford the Maldives. All it would take was working without weekends for the next 4 months. Thus began her long working days. Waking at 5 a.m. to finish household chores before leaving for work. Returning at 9 p.m. with extra projects. Weekends spent at the laptop. Occasional calls with questions. Mom, where do we keep winter clothes? Margaret, I can't find clean shirts. Mom, can you send another $300 for a taxi? By February, Margaret had finalized the hotel and dates. She booked an overwater villa, the largest one with 2 bedrooms and a private pool. She paid for flights, insurance, transfers, all for those happy faces she imagined seeing when she announced the gift to the family. In early March, when everything was paid for and booked, Margaret called a family meeting. I have a surprise for you, she said, looking at their puzzled faces. In May, we're all flying to the Maldives. For 2 weeks. The reaction exceeded all expectations. Karina squealed and threw her arms around her mother. Nicholas didn't believe it at first, then began frantically Googling the resort. Even Andrew broke into a smile and awkwardly hugged Margaret. This is amazing, he stammered. Are you sure we can afford this? I've calculated everything. Margaret smiled, enjoying the rare moment of family unity. The next 2 months flew by in preparation bustle. Karina endlessly bought new swimsuits and beach outfits, constantly consulting with her mother. Nicholas enthusiastically researched diving tours and local attractions. Andrew, overcoming his fears, read reviews about flights and watched videos about tropical islands. And Margaret worked. The new project proved more difficult than she'd anticipated. Management demanded results. Clients changed conditions, night meetings, stress, constant sleep deprivation. But she held on, knowing that soon they'd all be together, happy on the ocean shore. A week before the trip, Karina approached her with an unexpected request. Mom, can I bring Arturo with me? You know, the guy I'm dating. He can buy his own ticket. He just needs a spot in our villa. Margaret barely contained her irritation. Karina, this is a family vacation. Besides, the villa only sleeps 4. But Mom, we've been together for 6 months. He's practically family. Karina pouted as she'd done since childhood when demanding something. No, Margaret said firmly. And that's not up for discussion. Karina slammed the door. At dinner, she demonstratively stayed silent. Andrew, as usual, tried not to interfere in conflicts between mother and daughter. Nicholas was too busy choosing excursions to notice the family drama. 3 days before departure, on Wednesday, Margaret woke with the feeling that her head was filled with lead. Nausea rose to her throat, her right arm tingled. Overwork, she thought. It'll pass. She struggled to get out of bed, trying not to wake Andrew. In the bathroom, Margaret splashed cold water on her face and looked at her reflection. Pale face, circles under her eyes, new wrinkles that hadn't seemed to be there even a month ago. It's fine. I'll rest in the Maldives, she thought, opening the medicine cabinet in search of painkillers. Just 3 more days to hold on. But fate had other plans. That May morning, Margaret was preparing to make a festive breakfast. Only 3 days until departure, and she wanted to create anticipation for the vacation. The night had been rough, the headache wouldn't let go, but she blamed it on overexertion. Potato salad for Andrew, pancakes for Karina, eggs and bacon for Nicholas, each to their taste. Margaret carefully chopped vegetables when she felt the knife slip from suddenly numb fingers. A strange sensation spread through her entire right arm, then her leg. Margaret tried to lean on the counter, but her body wouldn't obey. Everything swam before her eyes. "Andrew," she called, barely audibly, but her voice sounded distorted, as if someone else's. Margaret tried to take a step toward the door and collapsed on the floor, knocking over a chair. In falling, she hit the dish rack. The crash woke Andrew. "What the Margaret?" He ran into the kitchen in his unbuttoned pajamas and froze, seeing his wife on the floor. "God, what's wrong?" Margaret wanted to answer, but her tongue felt swollen, immobile. She could only look at her husband, trying to convey with her eyes the fear and pain gripping her body. "Need an ambulance! An ambulance!" Andrew frantically searched for his phone, bumping into furniture. "Just don't move. Everything will be fine." Noise came from Karina's room. "What's happening? Why such a racket so early?" she asked sleepily, peeking out from behind the door. "Mom's sick. Call an ambulance," Andrew shouted, dropping to his knees beside his wife. Karina, seeing her mother on the floor, pressed her hands to her mouth in horror. "Mom, what's wrong with her?" "I don't know. Call the ambulance faster." The next minutes blurred for Margaret into a hazy picture. Frightened screams. Someone's hands trying to lift her. Nicholas's voice as he burst into the kitchen. "What? How? When did this happen?" Consciousness cleared, then clouded. The ambulance arrived in 12 minutes. A young EMT with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail quickly assessed the situation. "Looks like a stroke. Urgent hospitalization needed." He spoke calmly, giving orders to his partner. "Who's riding along?" "I am." Andrew stepped forward. "She's my wife." Margaret was carefully transferred to a stretcher. At the last moment, already at the door, she found the strength to weakly squeeze her daughter's hand, as if trying to say, "Don't worry, I'll manage." In the hospital emergency department, everything happened rapidly. The attending neurologist, a full-figured woman with a short haircut, quickly examined Margaret. Clear signs of ischemic stroke. Immediately to CT scan and intensive care. The gurney with Margaret disappeared behind double doors, leaving bewildered Andrew in the corridor. He sank onto a plastic chair, covering his face with his hands. The phone in his pocket vibrated continuously, Karina and Nicholas demanding news. The doctor came out 2 hours later. "Are you Margaret's husband?" "Yes." Andrew jumped up. "How is she?" "Ischemic stroke in the middle cerebral artery territory. Condition is serious but stable. We administered thrombolytics, performed initial procedures. The patient is in intensive care now. The next 24 hours will be critical. Will she survive?" Andrew's voice trembled. "Prognosis is cautiously positive. Good thing she was brought in so quickly, but recovery will be long and difficult. Right side paralysis, speech impairment." The doctor spoke, and Andrew felt the ground slipping from under his feet. "You can visit her tomorrow if her condition stabilizes." Andrew returned home in the evening, exhausted from hospital waiting and bureaucracy. Karina and Nicholas met him in the hallway. "Well, what are they saying?" Karina was pale, with eyes red from tears. "Stroke," Andrew answered wearily, taking off his coat. "Severe. She's in intensive care." "Oh, God," Karina whispered. "What now?" Nicholas asked. "When will they discharge her?" "I don't know, son." Andrew went to the kitchen, mechanically putting the kettle on. The doctor said that even if everything goes well, recovery will take months. In the kitchen, the knife Margaret had dropped still lay there, the uncut vegetables on the cutting board. Time seemed to have stopped here. Nicholas rubbed his forehead. "What about the Maldives? The flight is in 3 days." Andrew and Karina looked at him with bewilderment. "What Maldives now?" Karina snapped. "Don't you understand? Mom's in the hospital with a stroke." "I understand," Nicholas shot back. "It's just that everything was paid for, booked. Mom worked so hard for this. I'm just wondering what we do with the tickets and reservation." Andrew heavily sank into a chair. "I don't know. We'll have to look at the documents, maybe get back at least part of the money." The next 3 days passed in hospital corridors. Margaret was moved from intensive care to a regular room, but ahead lay a long road to recovery. Her right side barely worked. Speech was difficult, but consciousness remained clear. And this, the doctor said, was a good sign. On the fourth day after it happened, Andrew, Karina, and Nicholas entered the hospital room. Margaret propped herself up on pillows at their appearance. Pale, gaunt, with a detached look, this woman seemed only a shadow of the former strong and energetic Margaret. "Hi," she said quietly, making a visible effort to pronounce the word. "How are you feeling?" Andrew sat on the edge of the bed, but instead of flowers or fruit, he held a leather folder with documents. "The doctors say rehabilitation will take at least 6 months. Slowly," Margaret answered with difficulty, struggling to articulate the words. An awkward pause hung in the air. Karina nervously fingered her purse strap, a gift from her mother for her birthday. "Mom, we've been thinking about the trip to the Maldives," she finally began. "Yes, we'll have to postpone it," Margaret answered with effort. "Actually," Andrew cleared his throat, avoiding his wife's direct gaze. "Margaret, we talked to the travel agency. Rescheduling or cancellation would cost almost the full amount. Basically money down the drain." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you suggesting?" Each syllable was difficult, but she had to understand what her husband was getting at. "The trip's already paid for, dear, but you get better." Andrew tried to smile, but the smile came out guilty. "The kids and I will fly as planned. You need rest and treatment now anyway. And well, it's silly to lose that kind of money." Margaret stared at them, not believing her ears. She lay paralyzed after a stroke, and they were planning to fly off to the resort she'd paid for from her own savings. "And who will be with me?" was all she could ask. "We arranged with the neighbor, Mrs. Peterson. She'll stop by every day," Nicholas answered quickly. "And in the hospital there are nurses, doctors. You're in good hands, Mom." Andrew laid the folder on the nightstand. "Here's a power of attorney to manage your accounts. We'll need money for spending money and expenses their excursions. You understand, the Maldives are expensive." Margaret silently stared at the ceiling, feeling a treacherous tear roll down her cheek. Her whole life she'd lived for them, saved for a rainy day, denied herself small things, and here was their gratitude. "Will you sign?" Andrew held out a pen. Her hand barely obeyed, but Margaret found the strength to take it. "Of course," she said quietly, and signed the document with an unsteady hand. What else could she do? Make a scene in her condition? Forbid them to go? They'd do it their way anyway, and she didn't have the strength to resist. When they left, discussing who would take which swimsuits, Margaret stared out the window at the blooming lilacs in the hospital courtyard for a long time. The room was quiet, only the beeping of monitors. Outside the window, leaves rustled gently. Laughter came from the playground. Life went on, but for Margaret it seemed frozen in this sterile room with the smell of medicine. Mrs. Peterson came in the evening, a good-natured, plump woman of about 70, with a bag full of homemade rolls. "Margaret, dear," she fussed, seeing her neighbor. "What happened to you? As soon as I found out, I came right over. Andrew stopped by, said they urgently had to leave. Asked me to look after you." Urgently leave? Margaret thought bitterly to herself. How conveniently they explained everything to the old lady. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson," she managed to say with difficulty. "Don't trouble yourself." "No trouble at all. We're neighbors, Mrs." Peterson waved her hand, settling into a chair. "I brought you homemade rolls and some compote in a jar. Hospital food, you know how it is." The elderly woman talked nonstop, sharing the latest neighborhood news. Gossip about the neighbors. Stories from the lives of her numerous grandchildren. Margaret listened half-heartedly. The inner cold that had settled after the conversation with her family wouldn't go away. The next day, a nurse named Ellen entered the room, a woman Margaret's age, with kind but tired eyes. "How are you feeling today, Margaret?" she asked, checking the IV. Margaret wanted to answer fine, but unexpectedly for herself, she burst into tears. Tears flowed down her cheeks, and she couldn't stop them. "What happened?" the nurse asked anxiously, sitting down beside her. And Margaret, stammering with pauses, told her what had happened about the trip she'd planned for the whole family, about the betrayal of her husband and children who were flying to the Maldives while she lay immobilized in the hospital. "And there's this power of attorney. I didn't even look at what I signed," she finished her story. Ellen frowned, took the folder from the nightstand, and began carefully studying the document. Suddenly, she gasped. "Margaret, this is a general power of attorney for all your assets. Not just accounts, but real estate, securities too. They'll be able to manage all your property." Margaret felt the room swim before her eyes. How could they? Did they only see a wallet behind her years of care, a source of benefits? The realization of the scale of betrayal made it hard to breathe. "This needs to be dealt with immediately," Ellen said decisively. "Do you have a reliable person, a lawyer or notary you trust?" Margaret thought for a moment, then remembered Victor, a notary she'd worked with at the bank many years ago. They maintained friendly relations, sometimes meeting at professional events. Gathering all her strength, she dictated his phone number to the nurse. "Thank you," Margaret whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "It's nothing, nothing." Ellen carefully patted her hand. "Get well, and we'll sort this out." That evening, Mrs. Peterson came again, bringing pies and news. "Your family left for vacation, Margaret. I saw when a taxi pulled up to the building. They loaded their suitcases. So happy, smiling. Andrew told me you blessed them, so the trip wouldn't be wasted. What a good person you are, thinking of your family even in this situation." Margaret closed her eyes so the neighbor wouldn't see the pain reflected in them. Blessed, she thought. Convenient phrasing. "Thank you for coming," was all she could say. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep for a long time. From behind the slightly open door, muffled sounds of hospital life came nurses' footsteps, beeping monitors, distant voices. And somewhere out there, in the dark sky, a plane was carrying her family to the warm sea and white sands. Margaret imagined them cheerful, excited about the upcoming vacation. Maybe with a slight pang of conscience, they'd quickly drown with the first drink on the ocean shore. How could I have been so blind? She thought, staring at the ceiling. So many years living with people and not seeing their true faces. So many years giving everything and getting nothing in return. For the first time in many years, Margaret felt absolutely alone. And in that loneliness, in the silence of the hospital room, in the light of a street lamp falling through the window, a decision was born that would change her entire future life. The next day, when the morning sun barely broke through the hospital room blinds, there was a quiet knock at the door. Margaret turned her head with difficulty. Victor stood in the doorway, a tall, fit man about 60 with neat gray at his temples. He held a leather briefcase and a small bouquet of white chrysanthemums. "Hello, Margaret," he said, stopping at the threshold. "May I come in?" "Victor, please." Margaret tried to smile, but only a weak grimace resulted. The notary came closer, put the flowers in a water pitcher, and sat in a chair by the bed. His attentive gaze swept over the room, noting the absence of other flowers or any signs of family visits. "Your nurse called me. She told me about the situation." He spoke calmly, without excessive sympathy, which Margaret particularly appreciated. Pity seemed unbearable at this moment. "I brought documents. Where's this power of attorney in question?" Margaret weakly nodded toward the nightstand. Victor took out the folder, carefully studied the contents, and shook his head. Indeed, a general power of attorney with expanded authority, the right to manage all your movable and immovable property, bank accounts, securities. He frowned. "Who prepared this document?" "My husband," Margaret said with difficulty. "I thought so." The notary nodded. "There are violations in the execution. First, no notarization, which already raises doubts about the document's legitimacy. Second, there's no detailed list of authorities, which is mandatory for this type of power of attorney." He took forms from his briefcase and laid them out on the movable table. "We'll immediately draft a statement of revocation of power of attorney. Then prepare notices to banks about blocking all operations on your accounts pending clarification of circumstances." Ellen appeared in the doorway, with a tray holding cups of tea and a plate of cookies. "I thought you'd need refreshments," she smiled, setting the tray on the table. "How's it going?" "We're beginning to restore justice," Victor answered, nodding gratefully to the nurse. "Margaret, I need to know details. Which banks need notifications? Do you have safety deposit boxes? Real estate besides your main residence?" Over the next hour, Margaret, overcoming speech difficulties, slowly and thoroughly answered the notary's questions. Ellen helped when it was especially difficult to pronounce a long name or sequence of numbers. Victor methodically filled out forms, occasionally clarifying details. "We'll annul the power of attorney today," he said decisively when finished writing. "If you'll allow some advice, it's time to review other legal documents too. Particularly your will," Margaret thought. She'd made a will many years ago, even before Nicholas was born. Then everything was simple. Husband and children received equal shares of the property. The document hadn't been reviewed since. "Yes," she said firmly after a pause. "I want to change my will." Victor looked at her carefully. "Are you sure? This is a serious decision, especially in your condition." "Precisely. In my condition," Margaret managed with her unruly tongue. "I see. Clearer than ever." The notary nodded. "All right, let's discuss details." While Margaret's family packed suitcases, not even bothering to call the hospital, she, with the notary's help, not only canceled the power of attorney, but also drafted a new will. Most of her property now went to a charitable foundation helping stroke patients, as well as to Ellen, who had shown more care in a few days than her own family had in years. Margaret also directed the creation of an endowment to support young neurorehabilitation specialists. "Are you sure?" Victor asked cautiously, processing documents. "Absolutely," Margaret answered firmly, feeling a strange relief. For the first time in many years, she was making a decision thinking only of herself and her desires. Ellen, hearing about the will, shook her head decisively. "Margaret, I can't accept this. We barely know each other." "You're the only person who showed care," Margaret said slowly but clearly. "Accept it as a symbol of my gratitude." Victor folded the documents into his briefcase. "Now for practical steps. I'll send notifications to all banks where you have open accounts. Block any real estate transactions in your name. Create legal protection of your property during rehabilitation." Margaret nodded gratefully. "Thank you. Glad to help." Victor stood, preparing to leave. "I'll visit you regularly. We'll monitor the situation together." When he left, Ellen helped Margaret take a more comfortable position in bed. "How do you feel?" "Strange," Margaret admitted. "Like I've woken from a long sleep." "That's a good sign," the nurse smiled. "It means recovery has begun, and not just physical." That evening, when Margaret was already falling asleep, the phone on the nightstand vibrated softly. She reached for it with difficulty with her healthy hand. Andrew's name lit up the screen. With a calmness that surprised her, Margaret pressed the answer button. "Yes?" "Margaret, it's me." Andrew's voice sounded nervous and strained. "We're at the airport. There's a problem with payment. For some reason, the card isn't working." Margaret was silent, listening to her husband's rapid breathing on the other end. "Are you listening?" he asked after a pause. "We need to pay the baggage fee and for unlimited internet at the hotel." "And the card says declined." "Unfortunately, no," Margaret answered calmly, surprised at how clearly her voice sounded. "The power of attorney is revoked, and in general, I've reconsidered our financial relationship." "What do you mean, reconsidered?" Panic sounded in Andrew's voice. "We're already at the airport. We need money." "You have your own cards, your own savings," Margaret replied. "Enjoy your vacation at your own expense." "Margaret, you're not yourself. This is a consequence of the stroke. You need treatment," Andrew shouted, but she'd already pressed the end call button. The phone immediately rang again. Then again. Notifications about messages appeared first from Andrew, then from Karina, then from Nicholas. Margaret turned off the sound and put the phone face down. For the first time in many years, she didn't rush to solve other people's problems. In the morning, voices in the corridor woke her. Apparently, Andrew was trying to break into the room, but the duty nurse wouldn't let him. "You don't understand. She's my wife." His indignant voice reached Margaret. "She's gotten worse. She's making inadequate decisions. Visiting hours are from 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. sharp," the nurse answered imperturbably. "And according to our data, the patient's condition is stable with positive dynamics. But we have to fly. I need to talk to her. Come during visiting hours." The footsteps receded, and silence fell. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the tension of recent days finally release. She didn't know if they eventually flew or not, and for the first time, she didn't care. At noon, Ellen appeared. "You have a visitor," she reported. "May I let them in?" Margaret tensed, thinking Andrew had returned, but Victor appeared in the doorway. "All documents are processed. Notifications sent," he reported without preamble. "Your accounts are protected. Real estate is secure. Now you can focus on recovery." "Thank you." Margaret thanked him sincerely. "What about my family?" "According to my information, they did fly after all," the notary answered. "Your husband had to use his own credit card to pay for additional services." Margaret nodded. Strangely, this news didn't cause pain, only relief. Now that the decision was made, she could move forward. "I called a rehabilitation specialist I know," Victor continued. "He's ready to take on your recovery program. Very good specialist, worked in Switzerland." "Not sure I can afford it now," Margaret said with difficulty, thinking about the frozen accounts. "Don't worry about that," the notary smiled. "You have enough funds in a checking account that wasn't included in the power of attorney. Plus, your insurance covers a significant part of rehabilitation." The next 2 weeks, Margaret dedicated herself completely to recovery. With the same determination she'd once used to build her career, she now fought to regain mobility and speech. Ellen helped her with exercises, brought books on neuroplasticity, supported her when Margaret was ready to give up. The rehabilitation specialist Victor had recommended, Dr. Alexei, proved to be demanding but effective. "Listen, Margaret," he'd say, helping her perform difficult exercises for her right arm. "The brain has an amazing ability to recover, but it requires 2 things: regular practice and a positive attitude. The first, I can provide. The second, only you." And Margaret tried. Every day she performed all prescribed exercises, forcing uncooperative muscles to work. With a speech therapist, she trained articulation, repeating complex tongue twisters. In the evenings, she read aloud, recording herself to track progress. Victor regularly visited her, helping sort out legal questions. They transferred all accounts to another bank, changed passwords and access, prepared divorce papers. "Are you sure about the divorce?" he asked once, filling out more papers. "Maybe you should wait until you're fully recovered?" "No," Margaret answered firmly, and her voice no longer held any trace of former uncertainty. "Precisely now, when I'm physically weak, I need legal protection." The notary nodded understandingly. A reasonable decision. There was no news from the family. Margaret's phone was silent, no calls, no messages. Sometimes she looked at photos of the Maldives resort, imagining them there, sunbathing, swimming, enjoying life. Strangely, these thoughts didn't cause bitterness, only calm determination to go her own way. Mrs. Peterson continued stopping by with homemade baking and news. "Andrew called me yesterday," she reported on one visit. "Said everything was fine, weather wonderful, having a great vacation. Asked about your health, and—" She hesitated. "And asked to unblock the cards?" Margaret inquired with light irony. Mrs. Peterson looked embarrassed. "Well, he mentioned something about a misunderstanding with the bank, but I don't understand these things, so I told him that." Margaret nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson." After the neighbor left, she sat by the window for a long time, watching life in the hospital courtyard. Young mothers with strollers, elderly patients on benches, doctors hurrying somewhere on their business. Ordinary life, in which she now saw so many shades and details unnoticed before. The day before the family's return from the Maldives, Margaret was transferred from the hospital to a rehabilitation center. The room turned out to be bright and spacious, with a large window overlooking a park. Victor personally accompanied her during the move, making sure all necessary documents were in order. "You'll be comfortable here," he said, helping her settle in. "And most importantly, you'll get professional restorative treatment." Margaret looked at him gratefully. "I don't know how to thank you for your help. You've already done so," the notary smiled, "with your perseverance and will to live. You know, Margaret, I've seen many people in crisis situations. Most break. You're one of those rare ones who becomes stronger." That evening, Mrs. Peterson called, agitated and confused. "Margaret, dear, I don't know what to think. Your family returned from the resort, but they can't get into the apartment. The locks have been changed. Andrew called me, asking if I knew what was going on. I said I had no idea, that you were in the hospital." "Everything's fine, Mrs. Peterson," Margaret answered calmly. "That's how it should be. But what about them? Where will they live?" "Karina has her own apartment," Margaret reminded her. "And Nicholas, too. Andrew can move in with the kids." "Oh, Margaret, dear." Mrs. Peterson was clearly confused. "What happened between you?" "Just life," Margaret answered. "Sometimes it teaches unexpected lessons." An hour later, the phone erupted in a furious trill. Andrew was calling. Margaret stared at the screen for a long time, deciding whether to answer. Finally, she pressed the button. "I'm listening." "What's going on?" Andrew's indignant voice burst into the quiet room. "We're not being let into the house." "That's no longer your home," Margaret answered calmly. "I filed for divorce. You can move in with the kids. They have their own housing, bought with my money, by the way." "Margaret, you're not yourself. This is a consequence of the stroke. You need treatment," Andrew shouted. "On the contrary, I'm finally myself," Margaret replied, feeling confidence returning to her voice. "And yes, the stroke did clarify many things. You can't treat us this way. We're your family." "Family?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "Family doesn't leave a loved one in the hospital for a vacation. Family doesn't deceive with powers of attorney. Family support's in trouble, not thinks about their own benefit." "Margaret, listen. All documents are with my lawyer," she interrupted. "He'll contact you to discuss divorce terms." Margaret pressed the end call button and turned off the phone. The room filled with peaceful silence. Outside, sunset was beginning, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Margaret watched this riot of colors, feeling a strange calm. For the first time in many years, she completely controlled her life and her future. And though ahead lay months of difficult rehabilitation and legal battles, she knew she'd manage. That night, Margaret slept without sleeping pills. She didn't dream nightmares about illness and betrayal, but of the ocean endless, calm, with gentle waves rolling onto white sand. She stood on the shore, strong, healthy, free, and watched as dawn painted the horizon in tender colors. A new day, a new life. And she was ready for this journey. Early morning hours at the rehabilitation center began with the muted hum of voices in the corridor, the clinking of dishes on the distribution trolley, and bird chirping outside the window. Margaret wasn't sleeping anymore. Nights had become restless. Her body, accustomed to activity, protested against forced immobility, and her thoughts, as if left to themselves, circled around recent events, building a new picture of reality. The door opened quietly and Ellen entered. After Margaret's transfer to the rehabilitation center, the nurse had taken leave from the hospital and gotten a part-time position here to continue helping her patient. "Good morning, Margaret. How did you sleep?" she asked, opening the curtains. "Better, thanks." Margaret's voice had strengthened over the past weeks. Words no longer had to be pulled out with such effort, though sometimes she still stumbled over complex consonant combinations. Ellen helped her sit up in bed, propping pillows behind her back, and placed a breakfast tray on the bedside table: oatmeal, toast with cheese, yogurt, and tea. "You have a full schedule today. After breakfast, massage, then occupational therapy, lunch, and after that, speech therapy and physical therapy." Margaret nodded, concentrating on breaking the toast with her healthy left hand. Her right hand still didn't obey well, though progress was noticeable every day. "And at 6, you have a visitor," Ellen added, leafing through the procedures journal. Victor called, said he'd bring important documents. Margaret sighed. I hope the divorce is progressing. Are you sure you want this? The nurse asked carefully. After all, almost 30 years together. 28, Margaret corrected. And yes, I'm sure, more than ever, the illness clarified many things, as if a veil fell from my eyes. Ellen nodded understandingly. That often happens. When a person finds themselves at the edge, many things are seen differently. The morning and day passed in intense work. The massage therapist worked on uncooperative muscles on the right side, making them remember how to move. The occupational therapist taught her to perform the simplest household tasks again. Button a button, hold a cup, brush teeth. The speech therapist trained articulation, making her repeat complex sound combinations. By evening, Margaret felt exhausted, but there was something right, meaningful about this fatigue. Every pain, every effort brought her closer to independence, to a new life. At exactly 6, there was a knock at the door, and Victor appeared with his traditional bouquet of chrysanthemums and an impressive folder of documents. Good evening, Margaret, he greeted, settling into the chair by the bed. I see you've worked hard today. Margaret smiled. Every day is a battle, but I'm winning by inches. That's admirable, the notary nodded. I have news for you. I met with your husband and his lawyer. Margaret tensed. And, as expected, they're contesting your competency at the time of signing the power of attorney revocation and will change. Victor spoke calmly, without emotion, as if reading a weather report. They claim the stroke's effects impacted your ability to make decisions. Convenient position, Margaret said with a bitter smile. But they have no chance, the notary continued confidently. I brought in an independent medical expert who confirmed your competency at the time of signing documents. We also have testimony from your attending physician about the clarity of your consciousness from the first days after the stroke. He took several sheets from the folder. Here's the preliminary property division agreement. I prepared the most fair version, without unnecessary concessions. Margaret took the documents and began studying them carefully. Under the agreement's terms, the apartment where she'd lived with Andrew went to her as acquired with her personal funds. The country house plot was split in half. Bank accounts, stocks, and other financial assets were also distributed according to their sources. The lion's share stayed with Margaret. Andrew agreed? She asked, surprised. Not exactly. Victor allowed himself a slight smile. He insists on equal division of all property, including your apartment. But the law is on our side. Plus, we have documents about the property acquisition exclusively with your funds. Margaret sighed. I didn't think it would come to such battles. Unfortunately, in divorce, people often show their worst side, the notary observed philosophically. But don't worry, I have everything under control. He pulled out another document. I also prepared a letter for your employer, official notification of your condition and recovery plans. This will protect your position at the company during rehabilitation. Margaret nodded gratefully. Thank you, Victor. I don't know what I'd do without you. Just doing my job, he answered modestly. By the way, your children tried to contact me, called the office several times. What did they want? Mostly expressing outrage about the changed locks and frozen accounts. Your daughter was especially active. As I understood, she's having problems with mortgage payments. Margaret shook her head sadly. They're used to Mom always solving all problems. Providing, paying, covering. Well, perhaps this experience will be useful to them, Victor noted. Independence is never excessive. After the notary left, Margaret sat by the window for a long time, watching the spring twilight thicken. Lights came on in the park, and the last visitors hurried home along the paths. Somewhere out there in the city, her family was trying to adapt to a new reality without access to her money, without the ability to shift their problems onto her shoulders. Strangely, Margaret felt no schadenfreude, only light sadness for what could have been if their relationships had been built differently. The following weeks blurred into a continuous flow of rehabilitation procedures, training, and exercises. Every morning began with exercises, joint development, massage, Then sessions with the physical therapy instructor, hydrotherapy in the pool, fine motor skills training. After lunch, sessions with the speech therapist, psychologist, sometimes acupuncture to stimulate nerve endings. Margaret didn't allow herself pity or weakness. She performed each exercise, each procedure with fanatical precision, as if not just her physical freedom but her spiritual balance depended on it. And gradually her body began responding to her efforts. First, her right hand's fingers barely trembled. Then, she managed to hold a spoon independently. Then, take several steps without support. "You have remarkable results, Margaret," her rehabilitation doctor said, reviewing her chart. "Usually after such a stroke, patients recover much more slowly." "I have good motivation, doctor," she smiled in response. "I'm building a new life from scratch." In the evenings, when procedures ended, Margaret often talked with Ellen. Their relationship had long outgrown the formality of nurse and patient. They'd become true friends, two women the same age with similar views on life, who understood each other from half a word. "You know what I've been thinking about more and more?" Margaret said one day, looking at the setting sun. "How many people go through similar trials alone, without support, without knowledge, without means for good rehabilitation?" Ellen nodded. "I see it every day. It's especially hard for the elderly. Children are far away, no money for private centers, limited recovery opportunities. But something could be changed," Margaret said thoughtfully. "Create a support system, support groups, mutual aid, information, resources." "You've got an idea?" Ellen smiled, already accustomed to them being on a first-name basis. "Just the outline so far," Margaret smiled. "But I'm beginning to understand what I'll do when I leave here." After 2 months of intensive rehabilitation, Margaret could move almost independently, only leaning slightly on a cane. Her right arm was still weaker than her left, but fine motor skills were recovering. Her speech had almost returned to normal, though sometimes Margaret still stumbled when excited. Victor, who'd been constantly visiting her all this time, brought news. "The court approved your property division agreement. Your husband tried to contest it, but unsuccessfully. So the divorce is finalized?" Margaret looked carefully at the notary. "Yes, you're officially free," he nodded. "Your former family accepted the property division terms. Not without objections, but they accepted." "What about my apartment?" Andrew moved out, taking his personal belongings. "The locks remained changed, as you requested." Margaret thought, "You know, I don't want to return there. Too many memories." Victor nodded understandingly. "Sell? Yes, and buy something new. Something completely mine, without the past." That evening, Margaret told Ellen about her decision. "I'm thinking of moving closer to the rehabilitation center," she explained. "Maybe a small studio in a new neighborhood. Something bright, modern, convenient for someone with limited mobility." "Good idea," her friend supported. "New space, new life. And also," Margaret lowered her voice conspiratorially, "I have a plan. Remember we talked about supporting people after strokes?" Ellen nodded. "I want to create a support group. To start, a small club where people who've had strokes can communicate, share experiences, get specialist consultations. Then, perhaps, a foundation to finance rehabilitation for those who can't afford it." "Sounds wonderful." Ellen was genuinely delighted. "But it will take a lot of strength and time." "I have time," Margaret smiled. "And strength? You know, I feel such a surge of energy as I haven't experienced in years, like I've woken from a long sleep." "I'm with you," Ellen said simply. "I'll help however I can." The next week, Victor reported he'd found a buyer for Margaret's apartment. The price was satisfactory, documents were in order, the deal could be closed soon. "I also selected several options for new housing," he added, showing apartment photos on his tablet. "This studio seems most suitable. New building with ramps and elevator, 10 minutes from the rehabilitation center." Margaret looked through the photos. A spacious studio with panoramic windows, light finishes, and modern furniture. Nothing extra, nothing reminiscent of her past life. "I'll take it," she said decisively. "Process the documents." A month later, Margaret was discharged from the rehabilitation center. Victor personally came to take her to her new home. Ellen, who'd taken time off, joined them too. When they entered the bright, spacious studio, Margaret felt tears welling up. This was her space, only hers, created for her new life. No traces of the past. No memories requiring careful handling or painful erasure. "Welcome home," Victor smiled, handing her the keys. Margaret slowly walked through the apartment, touching new furniture, examining the view from the window, getting used to the thought that this was now her home. There was no place here for regrets or bitter memories, only the future. "I don't even know how to thank you," she said, turning to her companions. "You literally saved me." "Well, that's not quite right," Ellen smiled. "You saved yourself. We just helped a little." That evening, when Victor had left and Ellen stayed to help with settling in, there was a knock at the door. Karina stood on the threshold, pale, gaunt, with an expression of stubborn determination on her face. "Mom, we need to talk," she said instead of a greeting. Margaret, leaning on her cane, silently stepped back, letting her daughter into the apartment. "How did you find me?" she asked when they'd settled in the living area. "It wasn't easy." Karina nervously fingered her purse strap. "Your notary refused to give information. I had to contact acquaintances at a real estate agency." "Why did you come?" Margaret looked at her daughter carefully. "Mom, this is some kind of madness." Karina spoke quickly, as if she'd rehearsed the speech in advance. "You sold our apartment, divorced Dad, disappeared. I got fired from the agency because of mortgage problems. Nicholas had to move in with a roommate. Dad's renting a room on the outskirts." "And?" Margaret asked calmly. "What do you mean, and?" Karina was indignant. "We're your family. You can't treat us this way. This is all because of the illness. You're not yourself." "No, Karina." Margaret shook her head. "Precisely because of the illness, I'm finally myself. You know, when you're lying immobilized in a hospital and your family decides to fly to the Maldives, many things become clear." "Mom, we made a mistake." Karina's voice trembled. "I admit it was wrong, but you can't erase our whole life because of one mistake." "One?" Margaret smiled bitterly. "Dear, that was just the last straw. My whole life I lived for you, gave everything without getting anything in return. You know what I realized? I turned you into consumers. You got used to only taking, without thinking about what I feel, what I want, what I need." Karina lowered her head. "What now? You're crossing us out of your life?" "No," Margaret said more gently. "I'm just changing the terms. No more financial infusions, no more self-sacrifice, no more solving your problems. If you want to communicate, please, but as adults, independent people, as equals." "We won't manage." Tears sounded in Karina's voice. "Dad's depressed. Nicholas barely makes ends meet. I have mortgage problems." "You'll manage," Margaret said confidently. "You're adults, healthy people. Nicholas has a law degree. You have work in a prestigious field. Dad has teaching experience. Use it." Karina looked at her with a mixture of resentment and surprise. "You've changed." "Yes," Margaret nodded. "And it's the best thing that's happened to me in many years." When her daughter left without saying goodbye, Ellen, who'd heard the whole conversation from the kitchen, came into the living room. "Are you all right?" she asked, sitting beside her. Margaret took a deep breath. "You know, for the first time in many years, I'm really all right. Like I've dropped a heavy burden that was dragging me to the bottom." She looked out the window at the evening city, lit with lights. "Tomorrow we'll start working on our support group," Margaret said decisively. "I've got several ideas." When she fell asleep in her new apartment, in her new life, for the first time thoughts of the future caused not anxiety but joyful anticipation. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but now she walked it by her own strength, relying on her own decisions and the support of true friends. Sunlight penetrating through light curtains woke Margaret before the alarm. She'd been living in her new studio apartment for 6 months now, and every morning began the same way, with a feeling of freedom and calm. At first, the unfamiliar silence in the house was oppressive. There was no morning bustle, no clinking of dishes in the kitchen, no sound of water in the bathroom. But gradually she learned to value this solitude, not equating it with emptiness. Margaret slowly rose from bed. Her right leg still gave way a little in the mornings, but got stronger every day. She set aside her cane at home. She tried to manage without it, training her balance, and headed to the window. Life was already bustling below. Young mothers with strollers hurried to the park. Elderly neighbors settled on benches with newspapers. Athletes went on morning runs. Margaret smiled at her reflection in the window glass. Over the past months, she'd changed greatly, not just internally but externally. She'd changed her strict business haircut to something softer, more feminine. Gave up dark suits in favor of light, flowing outfits. Even her posture had become different, more relaxed, but still confident. The phone's ring interrupted her reflection. Ellen's name lit up on the screen. "Good morning," her friend greeted cheerfully. "Are you ready for the big day?" "As ready as a person can be for opening their own center," Margaret answered with slight excitement. "A little nervous." "That's normal," Ellen reassured. "I'll pick you up at 10. Everything's ready. Just finishing touches left." After breakfast, Margaret carefully selected an outfit. Today was a special day, the opening of her and Ellen's support center for stroke patients. What had begun as a modest mutual aid project had turned into a full organization over several months, with an office, consulting staff, and ambitious plans. Margaret chose a light blue dress with a wide belt and comfortable but elegant low-heeled shoes. Looking at herself in the mirror, she couldn't help noting how her face had changed. The wrinkles hadn't gone anywhere, but her gaze had become livelier, clearer. An inner radiance had appeared that even the most expensive cosmetics couldn't imitate. There was a knock at the door. Instead of the expected Ellen, Nicholas stood on the threshold, pale, gaunt, in a wrinkled shirt. "Mom," he began uncertainly, "can I come in? I need to talk." Margaret silently stepped back, letting her son into the apartment. Over the past 6 months, they'd met only twice. Both times, the meetings ended in quarrels and mutual accusations. "What happened?" she asked when they'd settled in the living area. Nicholas nervously clasped his fingers. I have problems. I got fired from the firm. I haven't been able to find work for 2 weeks now." Margaret looked at her son carefully, noting the shadows under his eyes, unkempt stubble, trembling hands. "And what do you want from me?" she asked directly. "I need help, Mom." Nicholas lowered his gaze. "I only have enough money for this month's rent. After that, I don't know what to do." Before, Margaret would have immediately opened her wallet or transferred the necessary amount, but now she just shook her head. "Nicholas, you're a lawyer. You have an education. You have experience, even if it's small. Why did you come again for money and not for advice or support?" "What's the difference?" he answered with sudden anger. "You always helped, and now because of some grudge you've abandoned us all." "Not because of a grudge," Margaret objected calmly. "Because I realized I was only making things worse for you with my excessive care. Look at yourself honestly, Nicholas. You're 26, and you still haven't learned to stand on your own feet." "That's cruel," he whispered. "That's the truth," Margaret said gently, and for the first time in a long while, she put her hand on her son's shoulder. "I can help you find work. I have connections in the legal field. I can give recommendations for interviews. But there'll be no more money, Nicholas. That won't help you or our relationship." He looked at his mother with distrust. "Are you serious? You won't even lend me money until I find work?" "Not even a loan," Margaret confirmed. "Because I know as soon as you have my money, the motivation to look for work will immediately disappear." Nicholas jumped up. "You've changed, Mom. You've become hard, heartless." "No, son." Margaret shook her head. "For the first time in many years, I've become myself. And the strangest thing is, none of you even noticed that before. I was just a function serving your needs." When he left, slamming the door, Margaret felt not resentment, but strange calm. Before, such a conversation with her son would have knocked her off balance for several days. Now she just sighed and returned to preparations. She had important business that gave her strength and meaning. Ellen arrived exactly on time. Seeing her friend, she immediately understood something had happened. "Everything's fine. Nicholas stopped by." Margaret answered briefly. "Asked for money. And you refused?" "I offered help finding work." Ellen nodded approvingly. "Right. Though probably not easy." "You know," Margaret said thoughtfully, "before it would have been unbearable. But now it's like I've found some inner anchor point I never had before." On the way to the center, they discussed final preparations for the opening. Over months of working together, their friendship had strengthened and deepened. They complemented each other perfectly, Margaret, with her organizational abilities, business acumen, and connections, and Ellen with her medical experience, empathy, and ability to find an approach to the most difficult patients. The New Life Support Center was located in a small but cozy space on the first floor of a residential building. Light walls, comfortable furniture, a thoughtful navigation system for people with disabilities. Every detail had been carefully planned. Round tables for group sessions stood in the main hall. In small offices, one could get individual consultations with a psychologist, speech therapist, physical therapist. Information posters hung on the walls, telling about stroke prevention and recovery methods. By the appointed time, the first visitors began arriving, stroke patients and their relatives. Margaret knew many personally. They'd already participated in preliminary meetings, helped with advice when organizing the center. But there were also new faces who'd learned about the project from social media or by doctor referral. Margaret greeted guests at the entrance, trying to give attention to each person. Here was a gray-haired man with a cane, a math professor who'd had a stroke 2 years ago. Beside him, a young woman, his daughter, who'd become his main support. And here was a young guy in a wheelchair, an athlete whose career had been cut short by a brain hemorrhage. And an elderly couple, the wife supporting her husband, who moved with difficulty but wasn't giving up. In each of them, Margaret saw a reflection of her own story, the same despair, the same fear, the same determination to fight. And for each she found words of support, not empty consolation, but honest conversation from someone who'd walked the same path. When everyone had gathered, Margaret stepped onto a small platform. Excitement gripped her. For the first time in a long while, she had to speak before an audience, albeit a small one. "Good afternoon, dear friends," she began, trying to speak clearly, though some uncertainty in her speech still remained. "I'm glad to welcome you to our New Life Support Center. A year ago, I experienced a severe ischemic stroke. That event divided my life into before and after." Margaret swept her gaze over the hall, seeing understanding and empathy in the eyes of those gathered. "The stroke took much from me: health, my usual lifestyle, illusions about a strong family. But it also gave me something priceless, a new view of life, true friends, an understanding of what's really important." She smiled, looking at Ellen standing by the wall. "Our center was created not just for physical rehabilitation, though that's also very important. We're here to help you return to a full life with new priorities, new understanding of yourself and the world around you, to support you in moments of despair and share the joy of small victories." The applause that rolled through the hall touched Margaret to the core. For the first time, she felt real recognition, not for money, not for position, but for what she'd actually done herself, putting in her soul and experience. After the official part, informal communication began. Margaret moved from one group to another, answering questions, sharing her experience, carefully listening to other people's stories. Each conversation convinced her of the correctness of her chosen path. Toward evening, when most guests had left, an unexpected figure appeared in the center's doorway. Andrew, her ex-husband. He stood uncertainly, as if doubting whether to enter. Noticing Margaret, he moved toward her. "Hi," he said quietly. "Can we talk?" Margaret nodded, indicating a small office away from the main hall. "Of course." When they were alone, Andrew was silent for a long time, examining his ex-wife as if for the first time. "You look good," he finally said. "Completely different." Thank you, Margaret answered simply. You've changed too. It was true. Andrew had lost weight. His features had sharpened. More gray had appeared in his hair. But the main change was in his gaze. The usual shadow of self-abasement had disappeared. Some new focus had appeared. I heard about your center, he said after a pause. Nicholas told me you organized something for stroke patients. Yes, we officially opened today, Margaret confirmed. It's worthy of respect. Andrew spoke with visible effort, selecting words. You always knew how to organize something meaningful. Margaret waited silently, feeling he hadn't come just to praise her new venture. I wanted to apologize, Andrew finally squeezed out. For the Maldives, for how we acted, it was inexcusable. Why now? Margaret asked. It's been almost a year. Andrew sighed. I guess I needed time to really understand and see that you managed, that you're all right, that you're actually stronger without us. So if I hadn't managed, you wouldn't have come? Margaret clarified with light irony. No, not like that. Andrew shook his head. It's just, when you filed for divorce, I was furious, considered you ungrateful, cruel, told the kids it was a consequence of the illness, that you weren't yourself. But then, when I had to pay bills myself, find housing, solve problems, I began to understand how much you did for us and how little we valued it. Margaret was silent, but a strange warmth spread inside, not from her ex-husband's words, but from realizing she'd truly been right, that her decision had changed not only her own life, but forced those who were close to change too. And then I heard about your center, Andrew continued, about how you're helping other people who went through what you did, and I realized how much stronger you are than me, stronger than all of us. You know, Andrew, Margaret said thoughtfully, I don't hold any anger toward you. Really, what happened was a necessary lesson for all of us. Can we get everything back? He asked hopefully. Margaret shook her head. The past, no. But the future, we can build anew, only now, on equal terms. What does that mean? Andrew looked confused. It means I'll no longer sacrifice myself for someone else's comfort. Won't solve other people's problems at the cost of my own desires. Won't pretend everything's fine when it's not. She smiled, looking out the window at the evening city. If you're ready to accept me as I am real, with my own priorities and boundaries, we can try to build a new relationship. Not a family in the old sense, but something more honest and equal. Andrew was silent for a long time, then nodded. I'll try, if you'll give me a chance. Not a chance, Margaret corrected. An opportunity for both of us. When Andrew left, promising to call in a few days, Ellen looked into the office. Everything all right? More than, Margaret smiled. Seems like today is a day of reconciliations and new beginnings. They left the center together into the warm summer evening. The city lived its usual life, people hurrying home, humming cars, lit windows of high-rises. But for Margaret, everything looked different, brighter, more dimensional, more meaningful. You know what I'm thinking? She said as they walked along the park alley. Sometimes you need to lose what you have to find what you really need. Ellen nodded understandingly. Like that saying about closing and opening doors. Exactly, Margaret agreed. When the door of my old life closed, I thought it was the end. Turns out, it was only the beginning. Ahead opened a wide park vista with blooming flower beds and a fountain. The sun was setting, painting the sky in tender shades of pink and gold. Margaret walked confidently, only slightly, leaning on her cane, not from necessity, but rather from habit. With each step she felt this new, regained life strengthening, a life that now belonged only to herself. That evening, sitting on the balcony of her new apartment with a cup of tea, Margaret thought about the strange irony of fate. She'd lost her health, her family in the usual sense, but gained something far more valuable: self-respect, a new calling, and understanding that life doesn't end at 52. Even after a stroke, it can be full, meaningful, and belong first of all to herself. Daily helping other stroke patients find strength for recovery, Margaret often said, Sometimes you need to lose what you have to find what you really need. And she'd smile, seeing how, in her listeners' eyes, despair gradually faded, and that same fire of determination ignited that had once saved her. Thus, a terrible illness and betrayal by the closest people became for Margaret not an end, but the beginning of a new, more conscious and authentic life. A life with room for pain and difficulties, but also for joy, discoveries, and real, deep love above all, for herself.